The slap echoed through the marble lobby louder than any alarm, louder than the clinking glasses at the breakfast bar, louder than the quiet sob a little girl was holding back near the elevator. In one sudden, humiliating moment, a tired, single father standing in worn shoes was struck across the face by a woman who believed he was nothing more than a nobody who had crossed his limits. What no one in that hotel realized was that those 9 minutes after the slap would become the longest, most unforgettable 9 minutes of their professional lives. If stories about kindness, second chances, and hidden strength move you even a little, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes a single story can change how we see people forever. That morning had begun like most mornings in Darnell Carter's life, heavy and rushed, full of small sacrifices no one noticed. He had woken before dawn in a modest apartment on the edge of Willowbrook, gently lifting his 6-year-old daughter Kira from her bed when she refused to wake up for school. Her hair was pulled back in braids he had carefully redone the night before, his fingers, still learning the patterns her mother had made, look effortless, her cheeks carrying the soft brown warmth of her mother's complexion, and her eyes held a quiet sadness she tried to hide every day since her mother passed away 2 years earlier. Darnell packed her lunch with the same care Monique used to, making sure to include the apple slices Kira loved and the little note with a heart that he drew every morning, tied her shoes with double knots so they wouldn't come undone during recess, and reminded her for the 100th time that he would be back before dinner, even though work often made that promise hard to keep. Everything he did revolved around Kira now, every breath measured by her needs and her fragile smile. Every decision filtered through the question of what kind of father, what kind of man he wanted her to see when she looked at him. The mornings were always the hardest, those quiet hours before the sun fully rose when the apartment felt too empty, without Monique humming gospel songs in the kitchen while making breakfast, when the silence reminded him of everything they had lost and everything he was trying so desperately to hold together with his own 2 hands. After dropping Kira at Cedarwood Elementary and watching her small frame disappear through the school doors, Darnell sat in his car for a moment, saying a quiet prayer the way he did every morning, asking for strength and wisdom and patience. He watched other parents walking their children inside, couples holding hands, mothers kissing foreheads, fathers lifting backpacks, and he felt the familiar ache of doing this alone, of being both parents in one imperfect body that never seemed to have enough hours or enough energy or enough love to fill the void Monique had left behind. Then he drove straight to the hotel downtown, a grand glass and stone building that shimmered in the early light along Magnolia Avenue. To most people walking past, it was a luxury hotel with chandeliers imported from Europe, uniformed staff trained in the finest hospitality traditions, and polished marble floors that reflected the morning sun like water. To Darnell, it was something else entirely. It was the last living dream he shared with his late wife Monique, the business they built together from nothing, the place where every brick carried a memory of struggle, hope, and love. He could still remember the day they had stood outside this building when it was just an abandoned warehouse, Monique's hand in his, both of them dreaming impossible dreams about what it could become. Her voice had been so full of hope that day, her eyes sparkling with visions of marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers and guests from around the world feeling welcomed and valued and seen. Yet almost no one there recognized him anymore. Since stepping back from daily operations after Monique's death, Darnell had chosen to observe quietly, letting managers run things while he focused on being a father first, on making sure Kira didn't lose both parents to grief and absence. That morning, Darnell walked into the lobby dressed simply in jeans and a plain button-down shirt, exhausted from another sleepless night by Kira's bedside after she had a fever and nightmares about her mother. The nightmares had been coming more frequently lately, around the anniversary of Monique's passing, and Darnell had learned to recognize the signs, the restless turning in her sleep, the small whimpers that preceded the full screams, the desperate way she would reach for her mother in the darkness and find only empty air. His shoulders were slumped under the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to lighten, his face unshaven because he had overslept after finally getting Kira settled at 3 in the morning, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion of years of grief and single parenthood, of trying to be both mother and father to a little girl who needed more than one person could give. To anyone watching, he looked like just another guest who didn't quite belong among the expensive suits and polished smiles, perhaps someone who had wandered in from the street looking for directions or a restroom. He approached the front desk to ask about a complaint he had received through an anonymous feedback channel, one that mentioned rude behavior and neglect toward families with children, particularly black families who felt they were being treated differently than white guests. The reports had been troubling him for weeks, describing incidents of dismissive attitudes, long wait times, condescending tones, and a general atmosphere of unwelcome that contradicted everything he and Monique had built this place to represent. The woman on duty, the operations manager named Veronica Lawson, noticed him immediately, but not with concern or respect or the professional courtesy that should greet every person who approached her desk. Her gaze swept over him with judgment, her eyes taking in his worn shoes and tired face, irritation building before he even spoke a word. She had built her authority on sharp words and fear, on making sure everyone knew she was in charge, and she had little patience for anyone she believed beneath her station or her standards. Veronica had risen through the hospitality industry, with a chip on her shoulder the size of a boulder, convinced that respect was something to be demanded rather than earned, that power meant control rather than service. She had learned early in her career that being perceived as soft was dangerous, and she had overcorrected in ways that had calcified into cruelty over the years. When Darnell calmly tried to explain why he was there and asked to speak privately about staff behavior and the complaints he had been receiving, she interpreted his tone as disrespect, as some random man trying to tell her how to do her job. Her voice rose, drawing attention from guests checking out and staff members preparing for the morning shift change, and her posture stiffened as if she were defending her territory from an intruder who dared question her methods or her authority. She demanded to know who he thought he was, coming in here making accusations, trying to get hard-working people in trouble. Darnell remained calm, his voice low and steady, explaining that he wasn't trying to cause problems, but simply wanted to understand what was happening, to make sure guests were being treated properly. But Veronica had already decided who he was, had already written the story in her mind about this man who didn't know his place. What happened next stunned everyone nearby and would be replayed on security footage dozens of times in the days to come. In a moment of unchecked arrogance and rage, Veronica raised her hand and slapped Darnell across the face with enough force that the crack of palm against cheek seemed to freeze time itself, accusing him of harassment and trying to intimidate her in front of her staff, calling him threatening and aggressive when he had done nothing but speak quietly and respectfully. The sound cut through the lobby like glass shattering, like a gunshot in a library, impossible to ignore or pretend hadn't happened. It was a sound that seemed to suspend the normal operations of the world, holding everyone in a moment of collective disbelief that stretched far longer than the fraction of a second it actually lasted. Guests froze mid-step, some with luggage handles still in their grips, mouths opening in shock. An elderly black couple near the breakfast bar set down their coffee cups with trembling hands, their faces reflecting the horror of witnessing such violence in a place that was supposed to represent safety and hospitality. Staff members turned away, pretending not to see, suddenly very interested in their computer screens and paperwork, complicit in their silence. A young bellhop named Terrence looked at the floor, shame burning in his chest, but fear freezing his tongue. Near the elevators, Kira, who had been brought along because the school nurse had called saying her fever had returned and Darnell couldn't leave her home alone, watched with wide, terrified eyes as her father staggered slightly from the force of the blow but did not fall, did not raise his hand, did not even raise his voice. Darnell did not shout. He did not curse or threaten. He did not strike back, though his hands trembled at his sides with the effort of restraint. He simply stood there, one hand slowly rising to touch his burning cheek, absorbing not just the physical pain of the slap, but the deeper pain of humiliation in front of his child, in front of strangers, in the building he and his wife had poured their lives into creating. The sting radiated across his face like fire spreading through dry brush, but the pain in his heart burned hotter, a devastation born not from the assault itself, but from what it represented, the betrayal of everything he and Monique had worked to build, the corruption of their dream, the failure of the culture they had so carefully cultivated. He thought of Monique in that moment, of how she would have handled this situation with grace and dignity, of the quiet strength she had possessed that made everyone around her want to be better. He drew on her memory now, letting it steady him when every instinct screamed for retaliation. He bent down slowly, his knees cracking with the movement, and gently wiped Kira's tears with his thumb, his touch tender despite the rage that must have been coursing through him. He whispered something to her that no one else could hear. Something about being okay, about everything being all right, the kind of lie parents tell their children to shield them from harsh truths. He told her that sometimes people do hurtful things because they are hurting inside, that responding to violence with violence only creates more pain. That real strength means controlling yourself when you have every right to lose control. Then he asked her to wait by the couch near the window, the one with the view of the fountain outside, and to read the book in her backpack. His calm frightened the staff more than anger ever could, more than yelling or threats or violence. There was something unsettling about a man who could be struck and humiliated and yet remain so utterly controlled, so completely composed. He looked around the lobby with eyes that seemed to see everything and everyone, noticing how quickly gazes dropped to the floor, how no one stepped forward to ask if he was all right or to condemn what had just happened, how silence became complicity, how fear of getting involved allowed injustice to stand unchallenged. He counted the faces, memorizing each one, not for revenge, but for understanding, wanting to comprehend how a place built on love could become so cold. He checked his watch, the simple timepiece that Monique had given him on their 5th anniversary, because they couldn't afford anything fancier. 9 minutes. He would give them 9 minutes. In those 9 minutes, Darnell walked slowly and deliberately to a quiet corner of the lobby near the business center, his footsteps measured and purposeful on the marble floor that he and Monique had chosen together, debating between 3 different types of stone before settling on this one with its subtle veining. He remembered that day vividly now, how they had spent hours in the showroom, running their hands over samples, imagining guests walking across these very floors, wanting something that felt elegant but welcoming, impressive but not intimidating. He made a series of phone calls, each one brief, controlled, and heavy with meaning and consequence. The first call was to Winston Clark, the head of the board of directors, a man who had invested in the hotel when it was just a dream and a business plan. Winston had been a mentor to both Darnell and Monique, had believed in them when banks wouldn't give them loans and investors laughed at their ambitions, had stood by them through every challenge and celebrated every triumph. The second was to Tamara Brooks, the attorney who handled all the hotel's legal affairs and had been a friend of Monique's since college. Tamara had stayed close after Monique's passing, checking in on Darnell and Kira, bringing home cooked meals when the grief was too heavy for Darnell to remember to eat. The third was to Charles Jenkins, the head of security, who Darnell had personally hired because of his reputation for integrity and fairness. Each conversation was short, factual, devoid of emotion, but filled with quiet authority. Years ago, when he and Monique had first opened the hotel, he had promised himself he would never run his business through fear or ego, that he would lead with the same grace and dignity that Monique embodied in everything she did. They had talked about this often in those early days, lying in bed after long days of construction and planning and problem-solving, dreaming not just about the building, but about the culture they wanted to create within it. Monique had grown up in poverty, had worked as a housekeeper in hotels where she was treated as invisible, where her humanity was erased by her uniform, and she had sworn that if she ever had the power to create something different, she would. Yet what Darnell had just witnessed, what had just happened to him in front of his daughter and a lobby full of people, told him the hotel had become exactly what he had promised it would never be, a place where power was abused and silence protected the abusers. His mind replayed the anonymous complaints he had been receiving over the past 6 months, messages from guests who felt disrespected, from families who said they were treated poorly, from black guests in particular, who reported feeling unwelcome despite the fact that this hotel had been built by black owners who wanted to create a space of excellence and inclusion. He remembered one message in particular, from a single mother who had saved for months to bring her children on a special trip, only to be treated with contempt and condescension from the moment she walked through the doors. She had written that she left feeling smaller than when she arrived, that the hotel had stolen something from her that couldn't be refunded or replaced. That message had haunted Darnell for weeks. He thought about the recent drop in family bookings, the decline in repeat customers, the tension he had sensed during his occasional visits, but had chosen to ignore while drowning in his own grief, and the overwhelming demands of single parenthood. The slap was not the problem, he realized. It was the symptom of something far deeper, a rot that had set in when he stopped paying attention, when he had trusted the wrong people with the legacy he and Monique had built together. As the minutes passed, Veronica paced behind the front desk, convinced she had asserted dominance, whispering to staff about calling security to remove the troublemaker who had dared challenge her authority and disrupt her morning. She felt vindicated, powerful, in control of a situation that had briefly threatened to expose the fragility of her position. Some employees nodded nervously, afraid of crossing her because they had seen what happened to people who questioned her decisions. They had witnessed the write-ups, the schedule changes that made life impossible, the subtle retaliation that destroyed careers without ever crossing legal lines. Others looked uneasy, their consciences bothering them, knowing deep down that something was terribly wrong with what they had just witnessed, but unsure how to speak up without risking their own jobs. Among them was a young woman named Shayla, who had only been working at the hotel for 3 months, but had already seen enough to know that Veronica's management style was toxic. Shayla had bills to pay and student loans coming due, and a grandmother who depended on her income for medication, and all of these realities conspired to keep her silent when every fiber of her being wanted to speak up. Kira sat quietly on the leather couch, clutching her backpack decorated with butterflies that her mother had bought for her 6th birthday, the last birthday Monique had been alive for, watching adults fail the most basic test of humanity right before her innocent eyes, learning lessons about the world that no 6-year-old should have to learn. When the 9th minute ended, marked by Darnell glancing one final time at his watch, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted dramatically, like the air pressure changing before a storm. The hotel's main entrance doors opened again, this time not with the casual ease of guests arriving for checkout or breakfast, but with purpose and weight and unmistakable authority. Senior board members, including Winston Clark, legal advisors led by Tamara Brooks, carrying a briefcase full of employment contracts and company policies, and Charles Jenkins, the head of security, accompanied by 2 other security personnel, entered the lobby together, their expressions serious and focused on the scene before them, on Darnell standing in the corner and Veronica behind the desk, and the staff scattered throughout the lobby pretending to work. Winston walked with the measured stride of a man who had seen many crises in his 68 years, but was still capable of being disappointed by human behavior. Tamara's face was set in the determined expression she wore in courtrooms, her eyes already cataloging details and potential legal implications. Charles moved with the alertness of someone trained to assess threats, his gaze sweeping the room and taking in every face, every position, every exit. Confusion rippled through the staff like a wave as they recognized faces usually reserved for boardrooms and annual meetings and emergency sessions, not breakfast service on a Tuesday morning in late September. Veronica's confident expression began to crack around the edges as she watched this procession of power enter the building, some part of her beginning to sense that something had gone very wrong, that she had made a terrible miscalculation. Darnell stepped forward from the corner where he had been making calls, his voice calm but steady, carrying across the lobby with quiet authority as he finally introduced himself, not with anger, but with truth, with facts, with the history that no one in that room seemed to know or remember. He revealed who he was, speaking his full name, Darnell James Carter, co-founder and majority owner of the Legacy Grand Hotel. He spoke about what the hotel meant to him, about Monique and their dream, about the years of work and sacrifice and love that had gone into every detail of this building. He talked about the nights they had spent painting walls themselves because they couldn't afford contractors, about the weekends they had worked 18-hour days learning every aspect of the hospitality business, about the loans they had taken out with their homes as collateral and the prayers they had prayed when those loans came due and revenue was slow. He explained why he had allowed things to operate as they were while he stepped back, talking honestly about his grief, about trying to be present for Kira, about trusting people to maintain the standards and values he and Monique had established. The color drained from faces across the lobby as the truth settled over them like a heavy blanket. Veronica's confidence crumbled into disbelief, her hand rising to her mouth, her eyes going wide with the dawning horror of what she had done, of who she had struck, of the career-ending mistake she had just made in front of witnesses and security cameras. Staff members realized in waves, some quickly and others slowly, that the black man they had ignored, the man some of them had smirked at when Veronica slapped him, the man they had allowed to be assaulted without saying a word in his defense, was the owner, the very person who signed their paychecks and held their futures in his hands. What followed was not a dramatic explosion of rage or a tirade of insults, but something far more powerful and deliberate and devastating in its calm precision. Darnell spoke about respect, about the responsibility of working in a place built on hospitality and welcome, about how cruelty grows like mold in dark places when good people stay silent and look away and convince themselves that it's not their problem. He addressed not only Veronica, who had slapped him, but every employee who had looked away, who had accepted a toxic culture because it felt safer than standing up for what was right, who had participated through their silence in creating an environment where such behavior was possible. He talked about the bystander effect, about how people convince themselves that someone else will intervene, that it's not their responsibility, that staying quiet keeps them safe. He explained that in his view, there was no moral neutrality, that silence in the face of injustice was itself a choice, a form of participation that enabled harm to continue. He spoke about his late wife, Monique, and as he spoke, her name his voice caught for just a moment before steadying again, about how she had cleaned rooms in this very building when it was owned by someone else, about how she had been treated poorly and disrespected and had dreamed of creating something better, a place where people were valued regardless of their position or appearance. He spoke about how she believed hospitality was sacred work that required a servant's heart, not a tyrant's fist, that true service meant seeing the humanity in every person who walked through the doors. He spoke about Kira, gesturing to where she sat watching with her big brown eyes, about what she had just witnessed, about the world he was trying to build for her, one where dignity was not determined by appearance or assumption, where people were judged by their character and their actions rather than the color of their skin or the clothes they wore. Then came the decision that would echo through the building long after that day, a decision that would be discussed in break rooms and industry conferences and business school case studies for years to come, a decision that some would call too harsh and others would call necessary and overdue. Darnell terminated the entire on-duty staff, from management to front desk supervisors to bellhops to concierge, effective immediately, with severance packages to be determined based on individual circumstances and length of service. Not out of revenge, he made clear, but out of necessity. He made it clear that a business could recover from financial loss, could bounce back from bad reviews or temporary closures, but could not recover from moral decay, could not survive the cancer of cruelty that had been allowed to metastasize in his absence and inattention. He explained that culture was not just what you said in mission statements or posted on walls, but what you tolerated day after day, what you allowed to become normal, what you accepted through inaction. The hotel would close for the remainder of the day and possibly longer. A full internal review would follow, examining policies and practices and complaints. Those who wished to return, who believed they could be part of something better, would have to reapply under a new system built on empathy, accountability, and respect for every human being who walked through those doors, whether they were guests or employees or delivery people or anyone else. The lobby fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of fear or complicity, or people pretending not to see injustice happening before their eyes. It was the silence of realization, of consequences meeting choices, of a reckoning long overdue, of people understanding perhaps for the first time that their actions and inactions had meaning and weight. Some staff members began to cry quietly, understanding that their lives were about to change dramatically, that the security they had taken for granted was evaporating in real time. Others stood stoically, accepting what was happening with a resignation that suggested they had known on some level that this moment was coming, that you cannot build a career on a foundation of fear and mistreatment without eventually facing a collapse. Veronica stood frozen behind the front desk, her career unraveling in real time, unable to process how completely she had misjudged the situation, how thoroughly she had destroyed her own future with one moment of unchecked rage and arrogance. Other staff members began to understand the weight of their own silence, how their inaction had contributed to a culture where such behavior could happen in broad daylight in a lobby full of people, how they had failed, not just Darnell, but themselves, and every value they claimed to hold. In the days that followed, news spread quickly through Willowbrook and beyond, carried by social media and local news and industry publications and word of mouth. The story became a flashpoint for larger conversations about workplace culture, about bystander responsibility, about the hidden ownership structures that meant you never really knew who you were dealing with. Some criticized Darnell for being too harsh, arguing that collective punishment was unfair to those who hadn't directly participated in the assault, that good employees were being penalized for the actions of one bad manager. They wrote op-eds about the unfairness of guilt by association, about how workers already struggling to make ends meet were being thrown into unemployment because of circumstances beyond their control. Others praised his courage, calling it a necessary reset in an industry where abuse of power often went unchecked, where toxic managers created hostile environments and good people suffered in silence because speaking up meant risking everything. Opinion pieces were written. Debates happened on radio shows. The Hotel Industry Association issued statements about workplace conduct and the importance of organizational culture. What few people saw, what didn't make the news or the think pieces or the social media debates, was the quiet moment later that night when Darnell sat on Kira's bed in their small apartment, the same apartment they had lived in even after the hotel became successful because Darnell believed in living modestly and investing profits back into the business and the community. He apologized to her for what she had witnessed, for the violence and the ugliness and the adult problems that had invaded her childhood. He promised her that being kind did not mean being weak, that standing up for what was right sometimes required difficult choices, that real strength was not about physical power, but about moral courage. Kira hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder, telling him she was proud of him for not hitting back, for using his words and his power to make things better instead of worse. In that moment, every difficult choice felt worth it, every sleepless night justified, every sacrifice meaningful. The hotel, which Darnell and Monique had named the Legacy Grand after Monique's grandmother Legacy, who had been born into poverty, but had instilled in her granddaughter a belief in the possibility of transformation, reopened 3 weeks later after intensive retraining and restructuring and soul-searching. The building looked the same from the outside, the same glass and stone and elegant architecture, but inside, everything had changed. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heaviness that had accumulated over years had finally been released. New employees were hired through a rigorous process that evaluated not only their technical skills and experience, but their character and capacity for empathy and their understanding of what hospitality truly meant. Candidates were asked not just about their previous work history, but about times they had witnessed injustice and how they had responded, about their philosophy of service, about what they believed they owed to strangers. They were trained not only in service excellence and proper procedures, but in compassion, in recognizing the humanity in every guest regardless of how they looked or spoke or dressed, in understanding that everyone who walked through those doors deserved dignity and respect. Families were welcomed warmly, with special attention paid to single parents and their children, with kid-friendly amenities and patient staff who understood that traveling with children was stressful. Complaints dropped dramatically within the first month. Bookings rose steadily as word spread about the transformation. More importantly, people felt safe and valued again, sensing a fundamental shift in the culture of the place, in the energy and atmosphere and the way staff interacted with guests and with each other. Darnell returned to a more active role in daily operations, not because he loved power or missed the spotlight or wanted to micromanage, but because he understood now that leadership meant presence, that his absence had created a vacuum filled by people like Veronica who valued authority over service, control over compassion. He restructured his schedule so he could still be present for Kira, still pick her up from school and help with homework and tuck her in at night, but also be visible in the hotel, walking the floors, talking to staff and guests, modeling the values he wanted to see. Veronica Lawson faced legal consequences and professional accountability that extended far beyond the hotel. The slap, captured clearly on security footage from multiple angles, became evidence in both civil and employment proceedings. She was charged with assault, pleaded no contest, and received probation and mandatory anger management counseling. She lost her hospitality management license after a hearing before the state board. She found herself unemployable in the industry she had worked in for 15 years, her reputation destroyed, her references non-existent. It was a painful but necessary lesson in humility, in understanding that power without compassion is merely tyranny in a uniform, that how you treat people matters, that actions have consequences. Some former staff members reached out to Darnell in the weeks and months that followed, admitting they wished they had spoken up, that they had known things were wrong but felt powerless to change them, trapped by fear of retaliation or losing their jobs or being labeled troublemakers. Terrence, the young bellhop who had looked at the floor in shame that morning, wrote a letter expressing his profound regret and his commitment to being braver in the future. He talked about growing up watching his father stay silent in the face of injustice at his own workplace, about inheriting patterns of avoidance that he now saw clearly for the first time, about wanting to break the cycle. Shayla came to Darnell's office in tears, apologizing and explaining the pressures she had been under, asking for guidance on how to balance moral courage with practical responsibility. Darnell listened to them too, meeting with them in coffee shops and in his office, because he understood that growth often begins with regret, and redemption requires the opportunity to do better. Several were eventually rehired after demonstrating genuine change and commitment to the new culture, after going through the same application process as everyone else, proving they understood what had been wrong and what needed to be different. Terrence became one of the most valued members of the new team, known for his willingness to speak up when he noticed problems. Shayla returned as well, and she became an informal mentor to new hires, sharing her experience of that terrible morning and the lessons she had learned from it. The story of what happened that morning spread through the Black business community in Willowbrook and throughout the state, becoming a case study in leadership and moral courage and the cost of staying silent in the face of injustice. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment now to like the video, share it with someone who believes in fairness and the power of moral courage, and subscribe for more